The signal arrived on a Tuesday, and it changed everything humanity had ever believed about the universe. It came from deep space, from somewhere beyond the edge of the solar system, riding on a frequency that no natural phenomenon could produce. And when the deep space antenna arrays in Chile and Australia picked it up, the scientists who first heard it sat in complete silence for almost an hour before anyone spoke. The message was not random noise, and it was not a mystery that would take decades to decode. The beings who sent it wanted to be understood, and they had wrapped the signal in a mathematical key so elegant and so clean that any species with basic radio technology could crack it open like a gift. And inside that gift was an invitation. The Galactic Concord, an alliance of over 4,000 spacefaring civilizations stretching across the entire Milky Way, was formally welcoming humanity to the stars, and all Earth had to do was respond. The welcome signal, as the world came to call it, asked for simple things: a species profile, a count of military assets, a measurement of technological capability, a declaration of territorial boundaries, and a statement of intent. And in exchange, the Concord promised trade, protection, knowledge, and a seat at the grandest table in the cosmos. Within days, the signal had been verified, translated, and leaked to every news network on the planet, and the world erupted into the kind of chaos that only something this enormous could create. Some people wept with joy because they said it proved that humanity was not alone, that the universe was alive and full of friends waiting to embrace them, and religious leaders called it a sign from the divine, and poets wrote verses about the dawn of a golden age. But not everyone was celebrating. In the quiet rooms beneath government buildings, in the secure chambers where decisions were made far from cameras and crowds, a very different conversation was happening, and the people having that conversation were not dreamers or poets. They were strategists, analysts, intelligence officers, and military commanders, and they had read the welcome signal with very different eyes. General Miriam Torres was the first to say what many were thinking when she stood in front of the United Governing Council, and spoke in a voice that carried no excitement at all. "They are asking us to hand over a complete blueprint of our entire civilization," she said, "and they are calling it a welcome gift." The room had gone quiet then. Chancellor Yun Seo-jin, the leader of the UGC, had listened to every argument from every side for 3 straight weeks: the scientists who begged to respond, the diplomats who wanted to open communication, the philosophers who said silence was cowardice. And she had listened to all of them with patience that bordered on something almost supernatural. But she had also listened to the analysts who had spent those same 3 weeks studying the welcome signal structure, and what they found beneath the surface was troubling. The signal was not just an invitation. It was a probe, a sophisticated intelligence-gathering tool wrapped in warm language, and the mathematical key that made it so easy to decode also contained passive scanning protocols that had been mapping Earth's electromagnetic output since the moment the signal arrived. They were already watching. And the more the analysts dug into the Concord's communication protocols, which the welcome signal had helpfully included, the more they realized something deeply unsettling. This was not the first time the Concorde had sent such a signal, and buried in the protocol headers were reference codes for hundreds of other worlds that had received the same invitation. Most of those reference codes were marked with a single symbol that the linguists eventually translated. The symbol meant acquired. Chancellor Yun made her decision on a cold morning in Geneva, standing at a window overlooking the lake, and when she turned to face the council, her face held an expression that none of them had seen before, something between grief and iron resolve. "We will not respond," she said. The room exploded, but she raised a hand, and the silence that followed was absolute. "We will not respond," she repeated. "Not because we are afraid and not because we are primitive, but because we are not fools. They want to know what we have, what we can do, and where we are vulnerable, and we are not going to tell them." And so Earth went silent. The Galactic Concord waited the standard period, 10 solar cycles of the target world, and when no response came, a bureaucratic clerk on a station orbiting a star 40,000 light-years away updated Earth's file in the Great Registry. Category 0, Pre-emergent silent world, no threat. The file was archived and forgotten within minutes, and the Concord moved on to more important matters, because in a galaxy of 4,000 civilizations, one quiet little world on the edge of an unremarkable spiral arm was worth less than a footnote. But Earth had not gone to sleep. In the decades that followed the silence, humanity did something that no other species in the galaxy had ever done. They listened. And they listened not casually or passively, but with the focused intensity of a predator learning the habits of every creature in the forest. The welcome signal had contained the Concord's communication protocols, and those protocols were a skeleton key to every transmission in the galaxy, and humanity used that key to open every door. Deep space listening arrays were built on the far side of the moon where no one could detect them, and relay stations were hidden in the asteroid belt, and within 20 years humanity was intercepting, decoding, and archiving more galactic communications than most conquered species generated in a century. They learned the languages, the politics, the trade routes, the military doctrines, the weaknesses, and the lies. And while they listened, they built. Not outward, because outward could be seen, but inward and downward. Shipyards carved into the cores of asteroids in the belt, weapons platforms hidden beneath the frozen surface of Europa, fuel depots buried in the methane seas of Titan, and command bunkers drilled so deep into the Earth's crust that no orbital scan could find them. The ships they built were not beautiful. They were dark, angular, and brutal, designed not to impress but to kill, and every one of them was coated in materials that absorbed sensor waves like a sponge absorbs water, making them nearly invisible to the scanning technology the Concord relied on. They called it the Ghost Fleet, and for 40 years it grew in the dark like something patient and terrible. The soldiers who crewed those ships trained in silence, lived in silence, and understood that their entire existence was a secret that could never be spoken aloud. And they carried that weight without complaint because they understood what the politicians and the poets on the surface did not, that the galaxy was not full of friends, and the silence was not empty. It was armor. And then, 42 years after Earth went quiet, a conquered trade vessel passed through the outer edges of the Sol system on a routine navigation check, and its sensors swept across the system, the way a bored driver glances at a roadside ditch. The scan report was filed automatically and read by no one of importance. It said, one inhabited world, no orbital presence, no energy signatures of note, primitive disregard. The trade vessel moved on, and the galaxy continued to spin, and 4,000 civilizations continued their endless games of power and greed, without sparing a single thought for the silent little world at the edge of nowhere. They had no idea what was waiting for them in the dark. The Galactic Concord liked to call itself an alliance, but anyone who spent more than a day studying its true nature could see what it really was, a feeding chain dressed in the language of diplomacy. At the top sat the elder species, civilizations so old that they measured their histories not in centuries but in geological ages, and they controlled the Concord's laws, its trade routes, its military doctrines, and its definitions of what counted as civilized. And at the bottom sat everyone else, younger species who had answered the welcome signal with open arms, and found themselves absorbed, taxed, mined, and slowly stripped of everything that made them unique. And somewhere below even the bottom, in a category so low it barely existed at all, sat the silent world's planets that had never responded, never announced themselves, and therefore, under conquered law, belonged to no one. Which meant they belonged to whoever was strong enough to take them. The Draelith hegemony had built an empire on exactly this principle. They were a reptilian species. tall and armored with natural bone plating along their spines and jaws, and they had been part of the conquered for 6,000 years, long enough to learn every loophole in every law and to use those loopholes like weapons. And their favorite law was the doctrine of silence, an ancient provision that said any world that failed to respond to the welcome signal within the standard waiting period could be classified as unclaimed territory and annexed without objection. The Dralith had used this doctrine to consume 11 worlds in the last 2 centuries alone, stripping each one of its resources and either enslaving or relocating its native populations. And the conquered had approved every single annexation because the law was clear, and because the elder species did not care what happened to worlds too primitive to speak. And now the Dralith wanted Earth. Fleet Commander Torvon stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Burning Claw, and reviewed the annexation order that the conquered assembly had stamped without debate just 3 days earlier, and he allowed himself a thin smile of satisfaction, because this would be the easiest conquest of his career. The intelligence file on Earth was laughably thin. 1 inhabited world, no orbital assets, no detectable military infrastructure, no energy signatures suggesting advanced technology, and a species classification of Category 0, which meant the natives were likely still burning fossil fuels and arguing about their own weather. Torvon had brought 200 warships, and privately he thought even that was excessive. But the hegemony liked to make a show of strength when claiming new territory, because it sent a message to the rest of the conquered about who was still powerful enough to take what they wanted. His fleet was a magnificent thing. Battlecruisers with hulls the color of dried blood, destroyer escorts bristling with plasma turrets, carrier ships loaded with atmospheric fighters, and troop transports packed with ground forces ready to establish control over whatever primitive civilization they found crawling around on that little blue world. Set course for the Sol system, Torvon ordered, and his fleet slid into faster-than-light travel like a pack of wolves heading toward a sleeping village. 6 months earlier, in a room buried 3 kilometers beneath the Swiss Alps, Admiral Kofi Assant had read the same annexation order. Humanity's intelligence network, the vast web of listening stations and decryption arrays that had been quietly drinking in galactic transmissions for 4 decades, had intercepted the Dralith petition the day it was filed, and they had watched it move through the conquered's bureaucratic channels with the calm attention of a chess player watching an opponent's hand move toward a piece. Assant was a tall man, lean and deliberate in his movements, with a face that seemed incapable of panic and eyes that missed nothing, and he had spent his entire military career preparing for this exact moment. The moment when the galaxy finally came to take what it believed was free. He activated Protocol Orpheus. The name was chosen carefully, Orpheus, the musician of Greek myth who walked into the underworld and came back, because that was what humanity had done. It had walked into the silence of the cosmos, and now it was coming back, and it was bringing something terrible with it. Across the solar system, buried installations that had spent decades pretending to be dead rock began to wake. On Europa, beneath the ice, power cores that had been running on minimal output for 20 years surged to full capacity, and weapons arrays unfolded like metal flowers blooming in the cold vacuum, and targeting systems calibrated themselves against the star maps that human intelligence had been updating in real time for as long as anyone could remember. In the asteroid belt, docking clamps released, and the ghost fleet stirred, hundreds of dark-hulled warships drifting free from the hollowed-out rocks that had been their cradles, each one running silent, each one invisible to any scanner the conquered had ever built. On Titan, launch bays hidden beneath the methane lakes pressurized and flooded their chambers with breathable atmosphere as pilots climbed into interceptor craft that had never once been flown in open space, but whose crews had trained in simulators so advanced that the difference was almost nothing. On Mars, the deep command bunker that served as humanity's strategic nerve center came fully online for the first time. Its quantum communication arrays linking every human asset in the solar system into a single coordinated network that could think and react faster than anything the galaxy had ever seen. And on Earth itself, the population went about their lives without knowing that their world had just transformed from a sleeping village into the most dangerous place in the Milky Way. Asant stood in the command center on Mars and studied the tactical display that showed the Dralith fleet's projected course. A straight line from hegemony space to Sol. No feints, no caution, no scouting elements ahead of the main force. Just 200 warships flying in standard conquest formation, as if they were arriving to claim an empty house. He felt something that might have been pity, but it passed quickly. "They are not even scanning ahead," said Captain Yuki Tanaka, his chief tactical officer, and there was something close to disbelief in her voice. "Why would they?" Asant replied, and his tone carried no emotion at all. "Their file says we are primitives. They think this is a formality. And when they find out it is not." Asant looked at the display for a long time, at the red dots representing 200 alien warships coming to enslave his species, and at the blue dots representing the forces he had spent a lifetime building in the dark, forces that outnumbered the incoming fleet by more than 2-to-1, forces that had been designed from the ground up to fight exactly this kind of enemy, because humanity had spent 40 years studying exactly how the Dralith waged war. "Then they will learn something that the galaxy should have figured out a long time ago," he said quietly, "and the lesson will be expensive." He turned to his command staff, men and women who had trained in secret, who had lived their entire careers in the shadows, who had never once been allowed to tell their families what they truly did. And he gave the only order that mattered. "Let them come all the way in, let them pass Neptune, let them pass Uranus, let them pass Saturn. I want them deep inside our system with nowhere to run and nothing behind them but empty space." He paused, and something shifted in his eyes, something old and cold and patient. "I want them comfortable." And so the trap was set, and the wolves came running, and they had no idea that the village they were approaching was not sleeping at all. It was waiting. Somewhere in the rings of Saturn, a weapons platform that had been dormant for 37 years received a single encrypted signal, and deep inside its core, a power cell the size of a building began to hum, and targeting systems older than most of the soldiers who built them locked onto the empty space where the Dralith fleet would soon arrive. The silence of the Sol system was perfect and absolute, and it would not last much longer. The Dralith fleet crossed into the Sol system like a parade marching into an empty stadium, and Fleet Commander Torvon stood on his bridge with his clawed hands clasped behind his back and watched the scanner displays with the relaxed posture of someone who had done this many times before. "Broadcast the subjugation order on all frequencies," he commanded, and his communications officer obeyed without hesitation, flooding every radio band with a message that had been used on a dozen conquered worlds before this one. A formal demand for immediate surrender, the presentation of planetary leaders for species cataloging, and the cessation of all military activity. Not that Torvon expected there to be any military activity to cease. The fleet passed Neptune, and the scanners showed nothing. They passed Uranus, and the scanners showed nothing. Torvon allowed himself a low rumble of amusement, a sound that among the Dralith passed for laughter, and turned to his second officer with a look that said everything his words did not. This was going to be the most boring conquest in the history of the hegemony. "No response to the subjugation order," the communications officer reported. "Of course not," Torvon said. "They probably cannot even understand it. Update the hegemony that we will have planetary control within 2 rotations and begin preparing the ground forces for surface deployment." The fleet pressed inward, 200 warships cutting through the black void in perfect formation, their engines burning bright against the darkness like a line of torches carried by giants, and every sensor on every ship confirmed the same beautiful, reassuring truth. The Sol system was empty, and Earth was defenseless, and this was going to be easy. They reached the orbit of Saturn. And then the universe changed. The first thing that happened was that every warning system on every Dralith ship screamed at the same time. Not a gradual alert, not a cautious sensor ping, but a full-spectrum emergency cascade that meant something massive and hostile had just appeared where nothing had been a heartbeat before. The weapons platforms in Saturn's rings fired simultaneously. There were 47 of them, buried in the ice and rock of the rings for nearly 4 decades, and they unleashed a coordinated electromagnetic barrage so powerful that it turned the space around the Dralith fleet's outer escort ring into a storm of invisible energy that overloaded shields, fried navigation systems, and killed power cores in the time it takes a heart to beat twice. 40 escort ships went dark in under 90 seconds, not destroyed, but blinded and paralyzed, drifting through space like dead fish in a current, their crews alive but helpless, their weapons offline, their communications reduced to nothing. Torvald spun toward his tactical display, and for the first time in his long career, he felt something he did not recognize immediately because he had so little experience with it. It was fear. "Where did that come from?" he snarled, but before anyone could answer, the second wave hit. They rose from everywhere, from the asteroid fields, from behind the moons of Saturn, from beneath the frozen surface of Titan, from orbits so dark and so cold that no scanner had ever thought to look there. And they were unlike anything the Dralith had ever seen. Human warships. They were not elegant and they were not beautiful. They were angular and dark and brutal, built like weapons rather than vessels, coated in materials that seemed to drink light and radar alike. And they moved with a coordination so precise that it looked less like a fleet engaging and more like a single organism with hundreds of limbs closing around its prey. The Ghost fleet outnumbered the Dralith 2-1, and it had been designed, every ship, every weapon, every tactical doctrine, specifically to fight this enemy, because humanity had spent 40 years intercepting Dralith military communications and studying their strategies the way a surgeon studies anatomy before making the first cut. Admiral Assant watched the battle unfold from the command center on Mars, and his face showed nothing, no triumph, no excitement, no mercy, just the calm focus of a man executing a plan that had been refined over decades. First wing, engage their left flank. Second wing, collapse the center. Third wing, cut off retreat vectors. I do not want a single ship turning around until I say so. The battle was not a contest, it was a demonstration. Human EMP swarms, tiny autonomous drones no bigger than a fist, flooded the space around Dralith battlecruisers and detonated in cascading waves that stripped away shields layer by layer like peeling skin from fruit. And the moment the shields fell, kinetic kill vehicles, simple tungsten rods accelerated to a fraction of light speed, punched through hull plating as if it were wet paper. The Dralith fought back because they were warriors and they were proud, and their plasma turrets filled the void with searing light, and some of their shots found targets. Human ships burned and broke and died, and human crews perished in the cold silence of space. But for every human ship that fell, 5 Dralith vessels were gutted, and the numbers were never close. Torvald screamed orders from his bridge, trying to reorganize his fleet into a defensive formation. But the humans seemed to know every formation in the Dralith tactical manual before he could even call for it. And every time he shifted his ships, the human fleet was already there, already waiting, already positioned to exploit the weakness that the new formation created. Because they had read every tactical manual the Dralith had ever written, intercepted, decoded, and memorized years ago. How? Torvald hissed as another battlecruiser on his starboard side broke apart under kinetic bombardment. How do they know everything? He never got an answer, because at that moment The hull of his flagship shuddered with the sound of something latching on from outside, and then the internal alarms began to wail, and his security officer reported the words that no ship commander ever wants to hear. Boarders on decks 4 through 7. Human boarding teams breached the burning claw in 4 places simultaneously. Armored soldiers moving through the corridors with a speed and efficiency that spoke of training so intense it had become instinct. And they did not hesitate, and they did not negotiate, and they did not stop. The Draelith ground troops on board were larger and physically stronger, but the humans fought with a ferocity that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than training. It came from the knowledge that their families were on the planet behind them, and that failure meant the enslavement of their entire species, and that fuel made them something that the Draelith had never encountered before. Unstoppable. Torvald was captured on his own bridge. They dragged him to the command chair and forced him to face the main display, and what he saw there broke something inside him that would never heal. A tactical overlay of the entire Sol system showing hundreds of installations, weapons platforms, shipyards, fuel depots, sensor arrays and fleet positions. All human, all hidden, all active. A military infrastructure so vast and so deeply concealed that the Conquered's best scanners had never detected even a whisper of it. "You have been here the whole time," he whispered, and it was not a question. The human officer who stood over him, a woman with a face like carved stone and eyes that held no pity, said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Of the 200 Draelith warships that had entered the Sol system, 141 were destroyed or disabled beyond recovery, 45 were captured intact, and 14 were left untouched. Those 14 were deliberately spared. Admiral Assant gave the order himself. "Leave their drives intact, let them run, they are going to carry a message for us." The 14 surviving ships fled the Sol system at maximum speed, their crews terrified, their sensors still recording, their data banks full of information that would shake the foundations of the Draelith hegemony and send tremors through every corridor of power in the Galactic Conquered. And as they ran, as they crossed the outer boundary of the Sol system and prepared to jump to faster-than-light speed, they received a transmission. It was humanity's first-ever broadcast to the galaxy, the first words Earth had spoken in over a century of silence, and it contained no greeting, no declaration of war, no demands, and no threats. It contained coordinates. Hundreds of them. Every hidden military installation in the Sol system, laid bare for the galaxy to see: shipyards, weapons platforms, fleet anchorages, sensor networks, command bunkers. A complete map of everything humanity had built in the dark, transmitted openly on every frequency the Conquered used. It was not a surrender, and it was not a boast. It was a dare. "Come again," it said without saying it. "Now you know what is here, and you know what it did to 200 of your warships, and if you want to try again, you know exactly where to find us." The silence of the Sol system was over, and what replaced it was something far more terrifying to the powers of the galaxy. A voice, calm and clear and unafraid, that said, "We are here and we have always been here, and we are not what you thought we were." And in command centers and throne rooms and council chambers across 10,000 light years, the beings who had dismissed Earth as a footnote read the coordinates and watched the battle recordings from the 14 fleeing ships. And for the first time in a very long time, the galaxy felt something it had almost forgotten existed: doubt. The battle recordings reached the Draelith hegemony first, and the effect was immediate and devastating. High Commander Sevareth, the supreme military leader of the hegemony, watched the footage from the bridge of his command station in orbit above the Draelith homeworld, and he watched it 3 times in complete silence. And each time he watched it, his face became harder and colder and more still, until it looked less like a face and more like something carved from ancient stone. 200 warships, the pride of his forward fleet, shredded in less than 4 hours by a species the galaxy had classified as primitive, and the recordings showed everything. The ambush in Saturn's rings, the ghost fleet emerging from the darkness, the impossible precision of the human attack, and worst of all, the final broadcast, the coordinates of every hidden installation. A challenge thrown into the face of the entire galaxy by a civilization that should not have existed at any meaningful level. "How?" Sevarith said, and the word fell into the silent room like a stone dropped into still water. His intelligence chief, a scarred veteran named Drothal, provided the answer that no one wanted to hear. "They were listening, High Commander. For 40 years they intercepted our communications, our tactical doctrines, our fleet deployments, our technology specifications. They learned everything about us without ever revealing themselves, and then they built a military specifically designed to destroy us." Sevarith's claws tightened on the armrest of his command chair until the metal creaked. "The Conquered told us they were Category 0. The Conquered was wrong." The recordings spread across the galaxy within days, because secrets of that magnitude do not stay secret for long, and the reaction was like dropping a lit match into a room full of fuel. The elder species, the ancient civilizations that had controlled the Conquered for millennia, reacted not with sympathy for the Draelith but with alarm for themselves, because the implications of what Earth had done were far more frightening than the battle itself. Earth had received the welcome signal and decoded it. That meant they were intelligent enough to understand galactic communication, and then they had chosen not to respond. That meant they were strategic enough to recognize a trap, and then they had used the signal's own protocols to intercept Conquered transmissions. That meant they were clever enough to turn the galaxy's tools against it, and then they had spent 40 years building a hidden military while the galaxy ignored them. That meant they were patient enough to be truly dangerous. No species in the history of the Conquered had ever done all four of those things. The Conquered Assembly convened an emergency session for the first time in 300 years, and the central chamber of the assembly station, a massive structure orbiting a neutron star at the heart of Conquered space, filled with representatives from thousands of civilizations, all of them talking at once, all of them afraid, and all of them pretending not to be. The Draelith demanded retribution, a coalition strike on Earth, a combined fleet of thousands, enough firepower to crack the planet in half and end the human threat forever. The elder species debated in their slow, careful way, weighing options and calculating risks, and doing what they always did, protecting their own power above all else. And while they argued, Earth sent a message. It was not a fleet this time, and it was not a weapon. It was a single ship carrying a single passenger, and when it arrived at the assembly station and requested permission to dock, the entire galaxy held its breath. The ship was called the Quiet Step, and it was small and unassuming, and designed to look exactly like what it was, a diplomatic vessel, not a warship. But every species that scanned it found the same troubling result. They could not determine its full capabilities, and the technology that powered its engines and its shields did not match anything in any Conquered database. It was a mystery wrapped in a hull, and that ambiguity was entirely deliberate. Dr. Lena Akafer stepped off the ship and into the assembly station with the calm confidence of someone who had prepared for this moment her entire life. Because she had. She was a xenoanthropologist who had spent 30 years studying every species in the Conquered through their intercepted communications, learning their cultures and their fears and their weaknesses, the way a doctor learns the body before performing surgery. She was not a soldier, and she was not a politician. She was something far more dangerous. She was someone who understood. The assembly chamber fell silent when she entered, because every being in that room had seen the battle recordings, and every being in that room knew that this small, soft-skinned creature represented a civilization that had just dismantled 200 Draelith warships without breaking a sweat. And the contrast between her gentle appearance and the violence her species had demonstrated was deeply, profoundly unsettling. She stood at the central podium, a platform designed for species 3 times her size, and she looked out at 4,000 civilizations, and she began to speak. "You call yourselves the Galactic Conquered," she said, and her voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the vast chamber through the station's acoustic systems. "And you sent us an invitation that you called a welcome signal, and you expected us to answer. And when we did not, you assumed we were too primitive to understand." She paused and let the silence work for her, because she understood better than anyone in that room that silence was a weapon. "We understood everything." She raised a hand, and a holographic display activated behind her. Data, thousands of files, intercepted communications, classified conquered records, intelligence reports. A cascade of information so vast that it took the assembly systems several seconds to render it all. "We listened for 40 years, she continued, "and this is what we heard." The display began to organize itself, and what it showed made the chamber erupt. 17 species, 17 civilizations that had received the welcome signal, that had responded with open hearts and honest profiles, that had declared their populations and their technologies and their locations exactly as the signal asked. And every single one of them had been invaded, absorbed, exploited, or destroyed within a century of responding. The evidence was undeniable: intercepted orders, classified annexation plans, resource extraction reports, population relocation directives. All of it pulled directly from conquered transmissions that the elder species had believed were secure. "You did not send us a welcome," Dr. Akafor said, and now her voice carried an edge that cut through the noise of the chamber like a blade. "You sent us a trap, and the only reason my species is still free is because we recognized it for what it was." The Dralith delegation roared in protest, calling the data fabricated, calling the human a liar, demanding she be arrested and her ship seized. But their voices were drowned out by something they had not expected: the sound of hundreds of other delegations murmuring in agreement, because many of the younger species in the Conquered had suspected the truth for a long time, and now someone had finally said it out loud with proof. The elder species said nothing, and their silence was the loudest sound in the room. Dr. Akafor stood at the podium for another hour, presenting case after case, species after species, world after world, a catalog of exploitation so thorough and so damning that, by the time she finished, the political landscape of the galaxy had shifted beneath the feet of every being in the chamber. Several delegates from younger species approached the human delegation in the hours that followed, quietly, carefully, through back channels and encrypted communications. Not the powerful species, not the ones with great fleets and ancient histories, but the small ones, the vulnerable ones, the ones who had answered the welcome signal generations ago and had been paying the price ever since. They did not want to join the Conquered's response to Earth. They wanted to join Earth. And as Dr. Akafor prepared to leave the assembly station, moving through the corridors toward her ship with the quiet grace of someone who had just detonated a bomb and was walking away from the blast, a figure stepped out of the shadows ahead of her. He was tall and impossibly thin, with skin like polished silver and eyes that held the depth of geological time, and she recognized him immediately from the intelligence files she had studied for decades. He was the Velori Elder, the representative of the oldest known civilization in the galaxy, a species so ancient that they had been old when most of the Conquered's founders were still learning to use fire. "You have made enemies today," he said, and his voice was like wind moving through a canyon, ancient and vast and indifferent. Dr. Akafor stopped walking and met his gaze without flinching, and she held it for a long moment before she responded, and when she did, her voice was steady and certain, and carried the weight of a species that had spent a century preparing for exactly this conversation. "We were already your enemies," she said, "now you just know it." The Velori Elder studied her for what felt like a very long time, and then something shifted in his ancient face. Not anger, not fear, but something that might have been respect, or might have been the recognition that the game he had been playing for millennia had just acquired a new player who did not intend to follow the old rules. He stepped aside without another word, and Dr. HFY walked past him to her ship. And as the quiet step undocked from the assembly station and turned toward Saul, the galaxy behind her was already beginning to crack along fault lines that had been hidden for thousands of years. Earth had not fired a single shot in this battle, and it had done more damage than the Ghost Fleet ever could. 1 year after Dr. Lena HFY stood in the Concord Assembly and tore the mask off the galaxy's oldest lie, the Milky Way looked like a different place. Not because the stars had moved or the borders had shifted on any official map, but because the truth had a way of rotting things from the inside. And the truth she had spoken was eating through the foundations of the Concord like acid through bone. 23 species had answered Earth's quiet call. They were not the powerful ones, not the elder civilizations with their ancient fleets and their hoarded technologies, and not the mid-tier empires with their trade networks and their political alliances. They were the forgotten ones, the small ones, the species that had answered the welcome signal with trust and had been rewarded with exploitation. The ones whose resources had been drained and whose autonomy had been eroded so slowly that most of them had not even realized what was happening until a human woman stood in front of the galaxy and showed them the chains they were wearing. Earth called the new alliance the Compact of Quiet Worlds, and the name was chosen with the same deliberate precision that humanity applied to everything. Because quiet did not mean weak, and the galaxy was only just beginning to understand that lesson. The Compact did not hold grand ceremonies or make public declarations. It operated the way Earth had always operated, in silence, through back channels, through encrypted transmissions and secret meetings and shared intelligence, because humanity understood something fundamental about power that most galactic civilizations had forgotten. The loudest voice in the room is rarely the most dangerous one. Admiral Kofi Asant, the architect of the Battle of Saul, personally oversaw the early training programs, traveling to hidden stations throughout the outer reaches of conquered space, where representatives of the compact species gathered to learn what humanity had spent a century perfecting: the art of invisible preparation. He taught them how to build without being seen, how to hide infrastructure in places no one thought to look, how to intercept and decode the communications of those who watched them, how to turn the galaxy's own tools into shields and weapons, and how to be patient above all. How to be patient, because patience was the sharpest blade in the arsenal, and it cost nothing, and it never dulled. The Conquered has ruled for 12,000 years because every species that joined it played by its rules. Asant told a room full of alien officers on a station hidden in the dust clouds of a dying nebula, and his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had proven his philosophy with the wreckage of 200 warships. We are not going to play by their rules. We are not even going to play their game. We are going to build our own game, and by the time they realize what we have done, the board will have already changed. Meanwhile, on the Draelith homeworld, High Commander Sevareth was consumed by a rage so deep and so total that it had become something beyond anger. It had become purpose, and that purpose was the complete and utter destruction of Earth. He spent months building a coalition, calling in favors from elder species, promising concessions and trade rights and military support, and slowly, methodically, he assembled what he believed would be the most devastating strike force the galaxy had ever seen: 3,000 warships drawn from a dozen different civilizations, enough firepower to turn the Sol system into a debris field, enough force to ensure that no human would ever threaten the Conquered again. The motion for a coalition strike was brought before the Conquered Assembly on a day that every historian in the galaxy would later remember, and Sevareth stood at the same podium where Dr. HFY had stood 1 year earlier, and he made his case with the cold precision of a career military leader who had reduced entire worlds to ash. The humans are a threat to galactic stability, he declared. They have demonstrated military capabilities far beyond what any silent world should possess. They have violated conquered communication security. They have harbored hostile intent toward member species, and they have formed an unauthorized alliance with dissident civilizations. The conquered must act now, with overwhelming force, before this threat grows beyond our ability to contain it. The chamber was silent when he finished, and the vote was called, and representatives from 4,000 civilizations prepared to decide the fate of Earth. The motion failed. Not narrowly, not by a handful of votes that could be attributed to political maneuvering, but decisively, overwhelmingly, crushingly. And Sevarith stood at the podium and watched the tallies come in and felt his certainty crumble like sand in a tide. Because the galaxy had changed in ways he had not seen. In the year since Dr. Akafer's testimony, Earth's intelligence network had not been idle. It had been doing what it did best, listening, learning, and sharing. And the information it gathered had been flowing outward through channels so subtle that the elder species never detected them. Trade records showing that elder civilizations had been manipulating resource markets to keep younger species dependent, shared quietly with the affected delegations before key economic votes. Military deployment data revealing that conquered peacekeeping forces were positioned not to protect member worlds but to intimidate them, delivered anonymously to species that had always suspected but never been able to prove it. Diplomatic communications exposing backroom deals between elder species to carve up the territories of smaller civilizations, presented with surgical precision to the exact delegates who would be most outraged by what they found. Earth had weaponized information, and information was a weapon that could not be blocked by shields or outrun by faster-than-light engines, and it had spread through the conquered like a virus, quietly reshaping alliances and loyalties and voting patterns, until the political landscape that Sevarith thought he understood had transformed beneath his feet without him ever noticing. The coalition strike was dead, and with it died the last realistic chance the conquered had of stopping what humanity had set in motion. The Velori Elder, the ancient, silver-skinned being who had confronted Dr. Akafer in the corridor of the assembly station 1 year ago, sat in his private chamber after the vote, and considered what had happened with the slow, deep thoughtfulness of a mind that had been analyzing civilizations since before most current species had evolved language. He had lived long enough to see empires rise and fall, to watch species ascend to glory and collapse into extinction, and he had learned that the pattern was almost always the same. The strong conquered, the weak submitted, and the galaxy turned on its axis of power the way it always had. But Earth had done something new. They had not conquered anyone, and they had not submitted to anyone, and they had not played the game of force and dominion that every other civilization in galactic history had played. Instead, they had simply told the truth, and they had told it so effectively and so strategically that the truth itself had become a force more powerful than any fleet. He reached out through a private communication channel, one so old and so secure that only the most ancient species in the galaxy knew it existed, and he spoke to the other Velori elders, scattered across their vast and hidden network of worlds. The humans have done something that has not been done in 12,000 years, he said, and his voice carried a weight that made even his fellow ancients pause. They have changed the balance of power without firing a second shot. They used silence to build, violence to announce themselves, and truth to reshape the galaxy. And I do not know how to counter a strategy that uses our own information as its primary weapon. There was a long pause, and then another elder spoke. Can they be stopped? The first elder considered this for a very long time. That is no longer the correct question, he said finally. The correct question is whether we can adapt to what they are building before it replaces everything we have built, and I am not certain that we can. On Earth, the world that had been silent for so long was alive with quiet purpose. Admiral Assant retired from active command, though everyone who knew him understood that retirement was just another word for a different kind of work, and the ghost fleet remained in its hidden anchorages, always ready, always watching, always a reminder that the silence had teeth. Dr. Lena Acaffer was named humanity's first galactic ambassador, and she carried out her work with the same calm precision she had shown in the assembly, building relationships, sharing intelligence, strengthening the compact, and slowly, carefully, constructing a new kind of galactic order that was not built on the domination of the strong over the weak, but on the shared strength of those who had learned to survive in the dark. Chancellor Yun Seo-jin, the woman who had made the original decision to stay silent all those decades ago, was very old now, and she spent her final years in a small house overlooking Lake Geneva, and sometimes visitors would come and ask her how she had known, how she had looked at the welcome signal and seen a trap when everyone else saw an invitation. She always gave the same answer. "I did not know," she would say, and her voice was soft and tired and honest. "I only knew that when a stranger asks you to tell them everything about yourself before they have told you anything about themselves, the wise thing to do is to say nothing and watch." And I watched, and what I saw told me everything I needed to know. Across the galaxy, in the hidden stations and secret shipyards and encrypted communication networks of the Compact of Quiet Worlds, 23 species were building, not armies to conquer, but foundations to endure, and they were learning from humanity the most important lesson the galaxy had ever failed to teach: that true power does not announce itself, and true strength does not need to be seen to be felt. The conquered still existed, and the elder species still held their ancient seats of power, and the Draelith still nursed their wounded pride in their fortress worlds. But the ground beneath all of them had shifted, and the cracks were spreading, and everyone who was paying attention knew that the old order was dying. Not with a bang, not with a war, not with a great and terrible battle, but with the slow, quiet erosion of a foundation that had been built on lies that one small species from the edge of nowhere had refused to accept. The galaxy had mistaken Earth's silence for weakness, and that mistake had cost them everything they thought they knew about power. And in the dark spaces between the stars, in the quiet places where no one thought to look, the Compact of Quiet Worlds continued its work, watching, listening, building, waiting, and the silence was not empty. It never had been. It was full of teeth.